So today, what we are trying to do is to give an overview of our benchmarking initiative and give some insights to you all from our initial reports. So Devin, if you have the agenda slide, and then most importantly, what we wanted to do is to kind of go through the results from the first report, and then how to get involved and where we are heading with this effort. That's our plan for today. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, Rob Suarez is the chair for the cybersecurity steering committee at MDIC, and he is the CISO for BD. And Chris Reid is leading the global product security and digital health director for Medtronic, and Greg Garcia is the executive director for health sector coordinating council. I'll bring up each of these speakers with some prepared remarks in a minute. And before that, I briefly wanted to highlight what MDIC is and what our cybersecurity initiatives are in just few slides. So if you go to the next slide, those who are new to MDIC platform, we are a non-profit public-private partnership and we are a consortium, as the name indicates. So we bring together medical device and diagnostic manufacturers, patients, patient advocacy organization, regulatory bodies like FDA, MHRA, UK, and so on, and of course, healthcare providers. And our main theme of MDIC is, as you can imagine, there are so much of barriers in advancing the medical technology across its total product life cycle. So, the innovation and advancement in the technology, if we wanted to bring it to the patient side, we need to, make sure that, whether it is the regulatory science and the best practices are created and developed or advanced, or even in some case, awareness is improved. So MDIC, bringing all the stakeholders work towards that particular aim. We have been in existence almost 10 years now. We've celebrated our 10-year anniversary in 2022. Next slide. And this just gets a sense of the programmatic areas. As I mentioned, we have projects across the total product life cycle. You will see clinical diagnostics, pathology. Some of our projects are in early feasibility studies. We do work on health economics and patient value, and a lot of importance on the real-world data, real-world evidence through our NEST collaborative community. And of late, we have been working on advanced manufacturing clearinghouse and augmented reality or medical extended reality. So you can see a plethora of initiatives if you visit MDIC website. And the most important thing is, as a public-private partnership and a consortium, almost all of the resources produced by MDIC is available as free downloads or free access to anybody who is interested. So I'll highly recommend to visit the MDIC resource page. Next page. And just to give a sense of what we have been doing, MDIC has been doing to advance the cybersecurity. Even though MDIC has been in existence for 10 plus years now, our cybersecurity initiatives started in 2018. And ever since, we have been focusing on 4 core areas. So, of course, you'll hear a lot about cybersecurity maturity benchmarking initiative in this webinar or in this presentation. But over and beyond that, we have been working on threat modeling for medical device sector, and CVD, which is coordinated vulnerability disclosure, and then penetration testing for medical devices. And under each of the category, if you advance the slide, Devin, we have multiple resources. Benchmarking report you will see in a minute, but in terms of threat modeling, we have worked with FDA and MITRE to produce a playbook for threat modeling for medical device with a lot of good examples and so on, again available as a free resource. We have been working Adam Shostak and Associate on providing boot camps on threat modeling, again, which is tailored for medical device stakeholders. And in terms of CVD, we have a report out there along with a beautiful hypothetical case study, which the industry can utilize. And we are also working on multiple best practice documents on the penetration testing for medical device. Next slide. And just to give a sense of what kind of resources we have, the playbook for threat modeling is available as a really valuable resource. And we are working with Shostak and Associates to provide a series of bootcamps on threat modeling. Actually, the next one is coming up on March 13. So please do visit MDIC website if you wanted to learn more about how to get some training and learn more about these activities. And again, MDIC platform is going to be a very unique opportunity to network and interact with other regulatory professionals across various projects across the total product life cycle. So whether it is cybersecurity or other project areas, please do send us a note if you want to learn more about. Next slide, please. Next, please. Yeah. With that, what I wanted to do is hand it over to Greg Garcia, who was instrumental in creating the so-called JSP document through HSCC, which has become the foundational step for the MDIC's cybersecurity benchmarking effort. Greg.
Thanks, Jithesh. I would say I was less instrumental in creating it and more in providing the big tent under which a lot of the stakeholders, the important stakeholders, would come together and develop the kind of good practices that ought to be implemented across the sector. Very briefly, the Sector Coordinating Council, for those not familiar, is, as it says, we are an advisory council to the government. We are one of 17 sector coordinating councils, one for every critical infrastructure sector like financial services and telecommunications and electricity, oil and gas, et cetera. Under a general national policy framework, these sector coordinating councils are self-organized industry organizations that are designed to work with government, those government agencies that have responsibility over a given industry sector. In our case, it's Health and Human Services and the Food and Drug Administration, to work together to identify and mitigate systemic threats to the sector's ability to deliver its critical assets and services to the public. In our case, it's delivering healthcare. And so the cybersecurity working group of the Health Sector Council is concerned about addressing the broad range of cybersecurity challenges that face the healthcare sector at a cross-sector level, whether it's direct patient care, medical devices, pharmaceuticals, plans and payers, health IT. We all subsectors suffer from various forms of cyber attack with different impacts, but the ultimate impact being patient safety. And this is what we are all coalesced around, is protecting patient safety from the various range of cyber attacks. And certainly one of the more prominent examples of where cyber attacks could cause harm is in the vulnerability of medical devices. And this was called out in a task force report in 2017 that noted that healthcare cybersecurity is in critical condition for a number of reasons, one of which is not enough security is being built in to medical devices from the ground up. And of course, hospital systems need to have better cybersecurity practices as well. But it was out of that task force report, the imperative for better medical device cybersecurity, that a number of major stakeholders, and Rob Suarez is here as one of the leads of that initiative, got together with FDA and other hospital systems like Mayo Clinic, which co-chaired the effort to develop what became known as, when it was published in January of 19, the Medical Device and Health IT Joint Security Plan. And Rob's going to go into more detail about what that entails. But essentially, it was a map for how to develop cybersecurity, design and develop and manufacture cybersecurity into medical devices. Over the past 3 years, that joint security plan has been in circulation. It is being implemented by a number of companies. It's not being implemented enough in others, and so the topic of this webinar is to talk about, well, how do we measure the effectiveness of a toolkit, of a best practice? How do we measure the amount of uptake and implementation of it? So that was really the impetus behind the MDIC benchmarking. It was really to benchmark where are we in medical device security. It's been more than 5 years since the task force report really highlighted this as a priority. It's been 3 years since we published this document. As the saying goes, you cannot improve what you cannot measure. So it's time to measure, and that's really that is our task before us now, and to use what we learned from this benchmarking to continue to make improvements and refinements to the joint security plan over time. So I'll pause there.
Next slide to Rob.
Yeah, thank you, Jithesh. And well, it's been said before, but certainly not said enough in healthcare. Cybersecurity is about patient safety. And the entire industry is on a journey towards improving cybersecurity and resilience. Part of making progress is understanding where we are today and how we can keep improving. The Medical Device Innovation Consortium and the cybersecurity working group there, in collaboration with the healthcare and public health sector coordinating council, launched the Medical Device Cybersecurity Maturity Survey in 2002. And the purpose of the survey was to establish a benchmark of the medical device industry's cyber maturity and to help organizations identify their own baseline for further improving cybersecurity and resilience. Having that baseline, it's useful for developing long-term strategic plans for increasing cyber maturity. It's part of promoting the safety and efficacy of medical devices, supporting continuous improvement to reducing cyber risks, and enhancing information sharing. This is something that other industries have done before as well. This particular survey was anonymous, and participants received a confidential report when they were done. Those individual metrics are also useful for sharing with stakeholders, company leadership, and board of directors who have oversight for cybersecurity and want more concrete information about an organization's progress towards stronger cybersecurity and resilience. And on slide 13, MDIC worked with Booz Allen to conduct a survey and establish the first ever cybersecurity benchmark, again, for medical device manufacturing industry. And the survey included 44 questions based on MedTech's joint security plan that was developed through the Healthcare Sector Coordinating Council. Again, the joint security plan was a template for measuring cyber maturity and assessing that maturity routinely. The categories within the joint security plan included organizational structure, risk management, design control, and complaint handling. And it's important to note that medical device manufacturers self-reported. Again, their responses were anonymous, so neither MDIC or Booz Allen verified those responses. And again, it's a starting point, but an important one. And so now that we've covered and talked about the logistics, I'll pass it to Chris Reed to talk about the key takeaways.
Thanks, Rob. I appreciate it. So I'd like to just give a little bit of a summary to go into a little bit more detail on what Rob shared here. First of all, on most of the questions, you know, they aren't really yes and no questions, most of them. Some of them are, like one of the questions is, do you have, and all these questions are published, by the way, in the Joint Security Plan themselves. And that was our fundamental rule for this benchmark survey, is we had to stick with those questions. But some of the questions like, do you have a product security officer? Those were yes and no questions, although we gave some clarification on what would qualify, if you will, as a product security officer. Most of the questions we gave scales using the CMMI model, which you see on the screen here. The idea from this is that you have maturity levels that basically span from non-existent, technically at level 0, non-existent. Level 1 would be that you may have some ad hoc instances of this happening. You know, manage, meaning that you have a process defined, but it's not necessarily consistently followed. All the way up to, you know, at level 4, you're actually measuring that process. And in level 5, you're actually not only measuring, but looking at how to optimize the process, like leveraging maybe a Six Sigma or just other approach to kind of optimize to make sure that process is working effectively. So one thing I want to note on this as we look at results is that unlike maybe other grading scales, it isn't necessarily the case that you want to see everything at level 5. You know, if you score level 5 across every question, in fact, I would argue that you may actually be over-investing in security because not every process needs to be have metrics and be fully optimized. A lot of that level 4 and 5 maturity goes to specific areas of focus where that might have an increased cost to the organization for not executing that process well. So I just want to note that, you know, the goal is not necessarily to be 5 across all these questions going forward. You can go ahead to the next slide. The other thing I want to note about scoring is that this gives you a very simplistic example of it, but we came up with criteria on each question about the types of evidence that would need to be present in order for you to grade yourself at a certain level. Because as mentioned, this was a self-reported benchmark report. And so, you know, we wanted to make sure that it was very clear, for instance, that at level 2, that you would actually have a documented process that you could produce that would reflect whatever content was in that specific question. And so we would say, for instance, that you may have a defined cybersecurity risk management process that's defined on paper. And then again, at level 3, that basically there was a policy requiring everyone to use it, that defined a process, and that you would actually be able to generate records showing that you consistently demonstrated that you were following that across your organization. That's just a quick example of, this is at a high level, but each question actually gave examples of what we expected to see for you to, we wanted to make sure we were, if you will, giving people the right, you know, everyone's going to generally want to score themselves high. So we were trying to make sure they understood like what types of evidence you might have to produce in order to justify giving yourself that score. And so I just want to maybe, you know, kind of to the point I had on the previous slide. In fact, you'll notice there's a little asterisk on level 4 and 5. We actually decided that in a lot of cases, the questions didn't make sense to have measurements or optimization. And so the top level score ended up being a level 3. There were questions that we talked about measuring. So for instance, when we talked about how fast we responded to vulnerabilities in the post-market, we actually did leave 4 and 5 as opportunities because, you know, FDA guidance is pretty clear of, you know, the timelines they're kind of expecting organizations to move at. And so measuring whether or not you're performing at those levels makes a lot of sense. However, you know, quantitatively measuring how your risk management process is working and optimizing it is not necessarily an easy thing to do. And so we didn't want to like lead people into thinking they should be measuring and optimizing things when it didn't make sense. So I just wanted to give that highlight before we flip to the next slide, because you're going to see on the next slide just a summary of the 4 categories. And the orange bar is essentially the top score if you answered all of them at the highest level. And so you'll notice that even in the organizational structure, you couldn't even accomplish a level 3. And a lot of that's because that had some basic yes and no questions, like, do you have a product security officer? And so that would naturally bring that average down. This is just a high-level representation of the score. There's some other ways we can look at it to help you understand how your organization would compare. But the blue lines here are the average scores from the MDMs and how they performed. And as I mentioned before, 1 is essentially the level where, you know, these processes might be happening, but they're not necessarily documented and repeatable. 2 would be they're documented and repeatable, and 3 would be that there's a process and you have consistent evidence of execution across your organization. And so you can imagine that to get most of these average at like the 1.5 level, you can imagine that we had scores come in that were probably below 1, and you had scores come in that were probably around 3, and that kind of pushed our average into that space. So I think if you go to the next slide, this is a bit of an eye chart, and I'm not going to go through everything on this because I want to get to questions. But it gives you an idea. A couple of things I want to call out. This is kind of some, I guess, some statistics, if you will, on each category. And it shows, for instance, organizational structure at the highest, the maximum number of points for the middle row there was 24, and the highest score was 24. So we had at least one organization at the top end that got a perfect score, if you will, which shouldn't be surprising. We have some pretty big companies that have invested a lot of money in this. However, I think what's important to highlight on this, we also had the lowest score at 5. Now that's a big distribution. And I think that's a lot of what we're trying to get to with the maturity of the industry, is how do we bring up that lower score higher to demonstrate that we can consistently meet a higher benchmark. I think, again, these scores were shown on the previous one, but the average score on this one was a 1.7. And so we would like to see those types of scores on the average maturity at least probably exceed level 2, which means there's a defined process. And ideally you're getting, you know, level 3 and above. I'm not going to spend a lot more time on this page, although I'm happy to answer questions in chat or live here in a moment. You can go on to the next slide. I just want to highlight one of the things I felt was particularly useful. If you answer this report as an MDM or answer the survey as an MDM, you have the option to opt in and get a report provided that shows your scores compared with the average. And one thing that I think is particularly useful is they added these what we call spider diagrams that kind of show maybe where you're exceeding the average and maybe other areas where you're not meeting the average. So one of the things I really think this tool is useful for is to help organizations prioritize where they plan to invest their resources. None of us have enough resources to like simultaneously improve across every question on the survey. So I think it's helpful to start to understand like where you may be lagging behind and may need to focus some attention on so that you can focus and drive some improvement in that area rather than doing a little bit across the board. You can focus and really bring those areas up. So I think that's incredibly helpful. And then lastly, this was mentioned before, you can head to the next slide. In the next, this is the intent of this was to help us improve not just today, but into the future. So, we expect we are going to continue to collect data and rerun and produce this report on an annual basis. And so organizations will be able to reassess themselves, re-report, hopefully show some progress. We hope to grow the number of organizations responding to it to get a bigger picture. And most importantly, we'll be looking at the data to try to understand where we could drive resources to help improve. One thing that pops up particular from this report One area that scored low, for instance, was supplier management, which shouldn't be a surprise to anyone in the industry. But we're talking through, we're actually working on updating the JSP right now. And we actually have a specific focus on supplier management to try to drive what good looks like in that space, as an example. And so we hope to try to, it's kind of a, evaluate, figure out what you're not doing well, both individually as a manufacturer, as well as an industry. We create some resources to improve, we share those, we remeasure, and the idea is we're going to get into the cycle to try to bring up the level of expertise and capability across the whole industry. And then I think with that, that's my last slide on summarizing data. Jithesh.
Thanks, Rob. Thanks, Greg and Chris. I think at this point we can, start the audience questions for the panelists. Again, just wanted to highlight that the survey is available for anyone to access, and we only showed the scores or summary scores from the four categories, but you can also see individual questions or 44 questions and the responses to that, and you can utilize it. And also MDIC website will have, you can get access to a lot of resources from multiple project areas. With that, it's time for audience questions. You can raise the hand, or also you can use the chat function in the Zoom toolbar.
Yeah, Jithesh, while we're waiting to see if anyone wants to raise their hand and ask a question or in chat. There was a great question asked about the April 2022 guidance in the chat. And I just want to call out that, first of all, I clarified that was draft guidance, so it's not in effect yet, but we expect that to be in effect this year. But if you read the guidance itself from FDA, it specifically calls the JSP out as a resource to help comply and help clarify in a few areas. So there's a strong, the point of MDIC is that we have a strong partnership with FDA, and so we're often in collaboration to try to make sure we're driving that clarity. The other thing I wanted to highlight is, a lot of where we're taking the JSP is really to be complementary to what's called a secure product development framework. What capabilities should you have to create secure products? And so it's absolutely something that would help you figure out if your program would help be able to comply with FDA's expectations of the final guidance once they publish it this year. So Jithesh, you want me to jump in and answer questions?
Yes, go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, I saw a follow-up question to that one, which is when will the new JSP issued? I would love to tell you it's ready to go, and it's not. We're shooting for a Q1 publishing date for it. There's a lot of work going on. I think the original Joint Security Plan, JSP, was published in 2019, early 2019. We are updating it to reflect a lot of progress and development that's happened since then, a lot of resources that have become available. And so we view the JSP as kind of being that map that kind of gives you that high-level program picture that then gets you to other resources that can help you build. But we do expect we're shooting for Q1, but it is a volunteer process through the Healthcare Sector Coordinating Council. So sometimes it takes a little bit of time to finalize. The next question, and I'll jump in. Rob, I'd love to hear your thoughts as well, but I happen to know a lot about the new law. At the end of last year, in the big omnibus package, many of you heard of passing right at the last moment in 2022. It was the Consolidated Appropriations Act of 2023. A lot of FDA, Food and Cosmetic and Drug Act legislation got published. And one of those was a refined version of what was passed early in the year called the Patch Act. And again, I view all these things as complementary. There's a lot of collaboration happening behind the scenes. There was a lot of alignment to give FDA authorities on how do they make sure new devices were meeting, reasonable expected cybersecurity guidance and expectations. And I think JSP helps with that. Rob, you want to add anything to that?
Just to quite simply say, I applaud, the progress being made with empowering the FDA to achieve good and assess and evaluate and enforce medical device cybersecurity. I mean, on on our side as practitioners of cybersecurity, it's very clear that cybersecurity is a resource-intense, highly complex activity that requires subject matter expertise. It requires time and resources and technology to help us get through it. And I expect no different from any other stakeholder in our industry, including our regulators. And I think the FDA Cybersecurity Working Group has courageously taken on this mission of advancing cybersecurity and building partnerships. So I see the increased investment in cybersecurity for them as a net positive.
Chris, you're muted.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
I said I was going to jump in since I have a couple of direct messages with questions that got asked. So I'm going to jump in and keep rolling if you guys are good with that. One question was, what about response times for vulnerability management on regulated devices, mitigation and remediation? Again, that's a specific. So right now, the best guidance we have on that is the FDA's post-market guidance, where and the JSP has at least 2 questions in the maturity that talks about this, and the differentiation is whether or not you have a controlled vulnerability or an uncontrolled vulnerability. And uncontrolled meaning it's unsafe or fails to meet, it would cause failure of essential performance. And so FDA set some guidance on 30 days to notification and 60 days to fix. I would emphasize that it's they use a carrot and not a stick at this point. They're trying to set some timelines, and so, but we did use those in the guidance in the JSP and in the questions and the maturity rating to kind of, just like FDA, they're trying to set an expectation. Can your organization evaluate and move this fast? I would say also for controlled vulnerabilities, the guidance was silent. But the new legislation does kind of set an expectation that there be a reasonably regular cycle. And so the new JSP, we're actually working to clarify what reasonably regular might be for certain types of devices, at least suggest some starting points. But obviously for each device, those could look different. Anyone want to add anything on that question? So the next question, sorry, I'm trying to scroll. Got lots of good questions coming in. Some of them directly to me, like I said, so not everyone could see them. The next question I got was, we had the experience with FDA that they expect us to meet draft requirements, requirements in the draft guidance. What is your take on that? Well, first of all, I can't speak for the FDA, but I will tell you the draft guidance is not binding, and they've been 100% clear on that. However, what I would maybe talk to on this, and this is what I've told my organization, the draft guidance clearly shows where their mind is at and going, and it just tries to add clarity on what their expectations are. Every time we've seen them enforce a higher level requirement, they typically point to older guidance, like the commercial off-the-shelf guidance or other, supporting guidance that basically allow them to demonstrate that they've got a final guidance that supports whatever statement they're making. But I would say that the draft guidance shows you where they're going, and I think it's a good thing to be aware of. But technically they cannot enforce what's in there, and it's not binding yet. Again, I think I'm the only one seeing these, so I'm going to go through. I think Jithesh, I think there was a question around, there was only 17 respondents at the time we published, and that's true. There was a question about the size of the organizations. Part of the report, if you go look at it, does show you breakdown. We did have a decent distribution of small, medium, and large manufacturers. And there are some interesting results on that. So I would agree, though, also that we want to get more than 17, which is part of why we're trying to publicize this. I think Jithesh provided me some information here that about half, 53% technically had more than 20,000 employees. About 40% reported more than 10 billion in revenue. So obviously we have some big companies, but they're not all big. The one super interesting thing on the demographics were that 65% responded that they weren't using the JSP, but they were answering their survey. That was incredibly interesting for us to realize that we had some work to do to kind of get that out. Any other comments from Rob or anyone? I don't mean to monopolize answer Q&A time.
No worries, Chris. It looks like you're the one getting all the questions, so I can't see them, but I appreciate you relaying. Just going back to the question around FDA's guidance being draft, I would say the other thing I would really personally emphasize is that while there may be draft guidance in place, the way I view the draft guidance is in fact as very helpful guidance in achieving what are obligations that exist today, whether it was, under quality system regulation and now really in alignment with ISO 13485. As medical device manufacturers, we have an obligation to demonstrate an ability to provide and to really consistently provide quality product to customers. And you can't have quality without cybersecurity. And there are very clear examples available in the guidance documents provided from FDA to provide those types of reassurances, not only through product development and in post-market, but ultimately to our customers that need to adopt these solutions. So I think while there's draft guidance in existence today, ultimately those documents are there to provide us and set us up for longer term success. So prepare and start adopting these practices now. As you can see them today, clarified in very simple terms in the MedTech Joint Security Plan.
Yeah, that's an excellent point, Rob. I often talk in my organization that ideally, if we're doing our job well, we don't have to worry about where the minimum we should be exceeding our FDA's at anyway. So it's a good marker to look at even what they have in draft and know that that's the, a minimum bar. The next question was, do legacy devices have to meet new guidance requirements? If so, what's the best way to handle this? So there's a little bit of nuance to this one. I'm going to jump in, and again, Rob, I'd love to hear you jump in as well. The JSP really focuses on capabilities, and those should be applied to our entire device portfolio, especially if we're still selling devices, but also if we're still supporting them. There are a number of documents coming out, especially from HSCC very soon, to further clarify expectations around legacy. Also, IMDRF is working on clarifying expectations of product lifecycle and legacy, where as devices are no longer sold or supported, there's certain activities that are happening to transfer responsibly any risks onto a healthcare organization that might continue to use that device. And so what my quick answer to that question would be, right now, especially the new legislation that we just talked about passing and the new guidance that's coming out, it really affects new submissions mostly. However, there's a lot of work happening to clarify how we go back and tackle this legacy device problem. And I expect there to be more documents this year, and ultimately, eventually more authorities for FDA. And they also will look at, if you read the draft guidance, they'll look at how they enforce even that you're managing your risks. If you have a device where you have a new generation, they're still going to expect to see how you're managing your older generation device or previous versions. And so you're going to see more and more of that enforced as part of the process. So I would say new devices have no excuse not to meet requirements. And increasingly, we're going to be clarifying how legacy devices are handled. Rob, do you have anything you want to add?
Yeah, thank you, Chris. Taking a step back, when we look at cybersecurity risks in medical devices, when there are no threat actors that look at these devices and say, "Oh, it's a legacy device. Let me not exploit that vulnerability." There are no vulnerabilities that exist in newer technologies that intentionally avoid or evade legacy medical devices. In fact, quite the opposite. Legacy medical devices represent essentially a compilation of many different vulnerabilities that have existed over time and continue to age. All technology has vulnerabilities, and over time, just like the human body develops aches and pains and diseases, technology develops vulnerabilities. And so there is absolutely an importance to apply all of these security best practices to your legacy medical devices that are already deployed at customer sites today, and to make decisions as medical device companies on how to manage those risks, including how to inform customers of those cybersecurity risks, empower them with information and guidance also on how they can protect against these risks, in addition to evaluating future changes and enhancements to medical devices to address cybersecurity risks. We say that cybersecurity is a team sport, but ultimately you can't protect what you don't know. And so that is why it's really important for medical device manufacturers to take these best practices, including what you see in the Joint Security Plan, including what you see from FDA guidance, and take a look at your legacy medical devices as well and figure out how to overcome those challenges. The last thing I'll mention there is shout out to Jessica Wilkerson, the Healthcare Sector Coordinating Council, great guidance on legacy medical devices coming through, again, the Healthcare Sector Coordinating Council. And then the other one is to keep a lookout for the International Medical Device Regulators Forum for their guidance as well on legacy medical devices, so you can understand the view of our regulators globally on harmonizing around the definitions and approaches to addressing legacy medical device cybersecurity.
Thanks, Rob. That's great. And I can't reiterate what you said enough. Lots of great work happening. There was a point earlier about how should we be looking at this? The key thing is for your organization, there's lots of work. There's clear. I can't imagine an organization doesn't have work to do in this. So these resources are available to help you identify and prioritize what work you should be focused on. And that's really what we're all spending time to try to clarify and do. I had a couple questions come in around SBOM. First one is it's a fair question. There were 3 requirements that were outlined in the new bill that got passed that after 90 days they're effective, and also new submissions are required to, by law, have those that information. And one of those was an SBOM, and so there was a question about whether or not we'd be mandated to submit an SBOM within 90 days. What I will tell you is it'll be the law in 90 days. How fast FDA actually enforces that and rejects based on not having it, that's up for them to work on how to implement. But that is one of the requirements that came to the new law. So I think I calculated that to be somewhere around March 28th. If you do a submission and don't have an SBOM in it, you can, I think you can expect us, you could, be caught by not being compliant with that. That being said, there was a follow-up question around SBOM practices and whether or not JSP was going to address SBOMs. Absolutely. In January 2019, when the first Joint Security Plan was issued, SBOMs was still kind of a high-level idea, and I don't think it's even mentioned at all in the first JSP because it was that early of a concept. The JSP, we're definitely working those into the practices and where SBOMs should be created and how they should be shared and things like that. Also, as Rob mentioned, IMDRF, in addition to a legacy guidance, is coming out with a final SBOM best practices guidance. I do want to acknowledge, though, that the whole practice of SBOMs is still very immature. And essentially, it is a practice that's, it's not a mature, like I think NTIA just last year had minimum elements of an SBOM, and FDA is working on, their guidance. I think what I would encourage is, don't let maturity be the enemy of getting it done. It's important to have it, and everyone will be maturing those practices, and they'll continue to be a more useful resource as we move forward in time. But the idea of waiting around and seeing whether or not SBOMs are going to take off is probably past. You need to be ready to have SBOMs in your submission. Hopefully I was clear answering that. Although Adam has a follow-up question here. Has there been any discussion on how information from SBOM might inform a decision on what's substantially equivalent? Adam, we don't have details yet on how FDA will judge. The best point is their draft guidance that says what they expect to see in an SBOM. Maybe what I'll do is say that the SBOM, the point of the SBOM is supposed to give light, shed light on, and drive transparency on what components are inside of a medical device. And I absolutely expect FDA to look to enforce other policies through the information provided there. So for instance, if you submit a new device that is on a operating system that hasn't been updated in 5 years, and you're submitting a brand new application, and by the way, that operating system has been updated since then, you're probably going to find a lot of friction on your submission. And I think that's a little bit of the point, is to have that transparency. How FDA actually drives decisions, they're still probably working through, and I can't comment specifically. But I do expect they will use SBOMs to support decisions they are making based on their authorities and their guidance. Rob, any other thoughts on SBOM, Rob?
Yeah, you're doing a great job, Chris. I would just emphasize that, many of us in cybersecurity are on a journey to make cybersecurity boring. And when you look at practices like SBOM, like having that nutritional label for your software, but also eventually really other software supply chain practices. I'm thinking of supply chain levels for software artifacts. It's another thing out there called SALSA as well. And really it's really about improving our ability to manage vulnerabilities as we develop and maintain software throughout its life cycle. So if you want to eliminate surprises and forget about just complying with eventually what is regulation, having things like software bill of materials actually accelerates our ability to find vulnerabilities and eliminate surprises in products when it comes to cyber vulnerabilities in third-party software and components before those products get shipped. It allows us to very quickly respond and identify vulnerabilities in products that are already deployed, again, as they're emerging and reported and disclosed by their third-party developers as well. So if you want to speed up your ability to manage vulnerabilities, if you want to speed up also your ability to communicate those vulnerabilities to customers, and also eliminate the surprises of cyber vulnerabilities in third-party components in your product submissions, then software bill of materials and SALSA and supply chain security for your software, it should be of interest to you. Those should be things that you're looking to achieve.
Yeah, maybe one more final comment, just because I work with FDA a lot. I support all of our businesses, and especially when we get into any difficult circumstances on these topics with the FDA. I just want to emphasize they've been more than reasonable on all these topics. I would echo what Rob said earlier. They've leaned in to try to improve the space, but I just want to emphasize, like, the more you lean in and work to meet the spirit of these things, they are incredibly reasonable, although they will draw lines when they need to be drawn. But I've yet to have a line that they've drawn that was unreasonable. based on their authority or anything like that. So just wanted to kind of emphasize that, these are really the right things to be doing to keep patients and networks and hospitals safe and operating effectively. So, there's a recognition of maturity happening, and so don't be afraid of that, is I guess my point.
If there are no other additional questions, Chris?
Nothing on my side.
So I just want to add a couple of things here. So you have seen a lot of questions here are, of course, challenges with submissions or challenges with the cybersecurity, controls management, right? And not necessarily a guidance or policy itself is going to be the solution. It might be a solution, but it might be a long term, right? But what MDIC is doing, or what health sector coordinating is doing, is creating a lot of discussions, best practices, or things that we can do right now in the confinement of existing policy, existing guidance, and so on. That process is equally rewarding and equally useful, as attested by all the stakeholders in the MDIC platform, HSCC platform. But we do recognize that there are a lot of organizations that are yet to realize the potential of these public-private partnership, whether it's HSCC for cybersecurity, or MDIC for multiple projects across the total product life cycle, where we don't need to work on policy or guidance or anything, but we still can work on best practices or things we can do right now which will improve your own submission. And for example, some of the things MDIC is working on digital health side is software submission best practices. That itself is how to write about software architecture and so on. So that has got immense value. So if your organization has not considered being a part of HSCC or MDIC, do consider, there might be some process of joining, or some eligibility criteria. For MDIC, we don't have individual members, we have organizational membership and so on. But showing up itself in this platform, MDIC or other platform, is going to be really, really useful and helpful. And again, I wanted to appreciate almost 80 to 90 people were attending this session. I hope this was useful. You have access to the actual benchmark report, all the links to HSCC sites and JSP document, and also access to multiple resources from MDIC. We hope you will take back this message and promote the benchmarking, whether it is for your own organization's individual assessment or as a tool for resource to gain more knowledge about how the industry is performing, and then of course come back to additional the next iteration of the benchmarking. And those who are new to MDIC's activity, please do consider checking out our website resources and ping us for additional information, and if you would like to engage and collaborate on various activities. And again, I wanted to thank Chris Reed from Medtronic, Rob Suarez from BD, and Greg Garcia from HSCC for spending their time and helping us this initiative and being part of this press event and the webinar. Thank you all. Have a great rest of the day.